Welcome to the Podunk Polymath, a podcast dedicated to the sentiments of a secular, sarcastic, screwed-up Southern SJW and skeptic. I'm your host, Chris. Come on in. This is episode 30 of the Podunk Polymath podcast. Thanks once again for joining me on this wild ride. I hope y'all had a super joyous week. On the pre-ramble, I just wanted to mention that there was a Trump rally, a pro-Trump rally here in the Nash Vegas area downtown, and there was a gentleman wearing a shirt that says slavery got shit done. How clever is that? So a picture was taken, and it's been all over the place, and they found out who the guy is, and it's just kind of disgusting. It makes the city look bad, and it just goes to show what kind of mindset supporters have. So of course it's on my personal page. I'll probably post it on the show page as well. I'll put a link to it in the notes, but it's pretty bad. Nothing I can do, but he keeps popping up in the news, or his supporters do, so sorry about that. On a more positive note, it's 2 weeks until, a little less than 2 weeks now when this comes out. NanoCon will be March 18th at Unity Church in Nashville. It's on Franklin Road. Of course, all the relevant information is at NashvilleNuns.com. Go check it out. I hope to see everybody there. It should be fun. It's relatively cheap. And what else you got to do on a Saturday? Really? Come on now. So, yeah, go check it out. On the palaver this week, I have a lady named Jessica Xiao. She talks to me about intersectional feminism, but also so many other things. She is very informative, very bright, and quite talkative, but that's okay because she has lots of information to dole out. And I've learned quite a bit from listening to her, and also her writing and her Facebook posts, because we're friends on Facebook. So I hope y'all learned as much as I did, and I hope y'all enjoyed the rest of the show.
We, the nuns, the non-religious, unaffiliated, atheists, agnostics, humanists, and heathens, are statistically the fastest growing group in the nation. But here in the Bible Belt, you'd never know it. Are you fine without faith? Are you good without a God? If you're questioning your beliefs or you're happily religion-free, join us in March for NanoCon. NanoCon, the Nashville Nuns Convention, is a one-day secular extravaganza. Last year, NanoCon drew over 400 participants for an affordable full day of speakers, workshops, vendors, music, food, and fun. The 2017 NanoCon is stepping it up with the brilliant Matt Dillahunty as keynote speaker. We are building an inclusive community of thinking people, just like you, so be there. St. Patrick's Day weekend, Saturday, March 18th. Learn more and get tickets online at www.nanocon.info. Let's get this party started.
Has In God We Trust invaded your town? Are you tired of government officials who want to plaster In God We Trust on taxpayer-owned property? Are you afraid because your local sheriff placed an In God We Trust decal on the patrol cars? We are here to help. The Original Motto Project is for those who feel the separation of church and state is an important issue and should be honored regardless of your belief or lack thereof. Theists, non-theists, and all free thinkers are welcome. We need your support to show politicians that diversity exists within our nation, and their promotion of a monotheistic religion and push for theocracy will not be tolerated. Stand up and be heard. Join us at originalmotto.us.
Welcome to another edition of the Palaver here in the Podunk Polymath podcast. This week I have someone with me who is an awesome person. Let me read her little bio here. She's a self-proclaimed nerd and book hoarder who is guilty of Sundoku. I'm not even sure I'll ask what that is. Often inaccurately described as Canadian, she thinks of herself more as a Montrealer with U.S. citizenship living in Washington, D.C. After having obtained her B.A. and SC in psychology and the dark art of economics at McGill University. She's a grant writer for the Montreal-based International Women's Economic Development nonprofit Aristri Sud and the former assistant editor and writer of The Humanist. She believes in empathetic action and bringing our whole selves to every aspect of our lives for transformational social change. She frequently quotes Dorothy Parker and writes bad poetry at stillsolvingforx.tumblr.com. Contact her, especially if you have an eccentric side hustle you want to collab on or if you need a muse. And you can read her articles here. I'm going to put all these links after the fact. And she also said she wanted me to say something about radical vulnerability, but doesn't really matter, but I think it does. Anyway, so I present you Jessica Xiao. How's it going, Jessica?
Good. Thank you for that introduction, Chris. I just wanted to correct, I was a project assistant at the American Humanist Association, so one of the things I did was edit for thehumanist.com and write for thehumanist.com as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you for adding that part.
And Sundoku, if you're interested, is the condition of acquiring reading materials and kind of hoarding them without necessarily reading all of them. So I do that a lot.
Oh, hoarding books. That's fine. Okay. I can understand that, even though I'll admit that most of mine are ebooks. But I do have a lot of them that I haven't read yet. So I guess it's sort of the the 21st century version, maybe. I don't know, of hoarding books.
Yeah, I think so.
I wanted to have you on because we were talking. I had seen a couple posts of yours talking about white feminism, and I wanted to have you on to talk about intersectional feminism because I've noticed that's one of the things you're passionate about, and especially in light of the Women's March in D.C. and other places, in sympathy for that. And I noticed that you were kind of upset about the fact that there didn't seem to be a whole lot of diversity in. It's just mostly white women, basically. First of all, what is feminism? What do you think feminism is, just in general?
So I think, to me, the reason why I would describe myself as a feminist is because I believe feminism is the fight for human equality. And I mean this in the sense beyond the gender binary, which is the way that we generally see feminism, because that's where it originated from the fight for women's rights in our very patriarchal system that we have in the United States, and also the patriarchy that exists globally. However, nowadays, today, I think that when we discuss feminism, or the people who I associate with who discuss feminism, discuss intersectional feminism. And this is more about dismantling systems of oppression and, I guess, being able to understand the lived experiences of different identities and how the multiple identities that we embody and that other people see us as, that we are visibly identified as well as the ones that affect the way we interact with the world, how those lived experiences differ and how they're affected by the norms of whatever institution, the kind of society we live in, and then trying to figure out how to create policies or how to change the system in a way that people can have more equal access to equal opportunity to succeed in life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So that's feminism. What is intersectional feminism?
Sure. So for me, the way I had defined feminism was basically the way I would also define intersectional feminism. Intersectionality is an academic theory that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a critical race theorist. And basically, intersectionality means that we have to evaluate how society affects people based on their multiple identities and the interactions that happen between us and other people are what's that word? Like the sum of the part is greater than the whole. You can't really separate my existence as being visibly Chinese, as being born in the U.S., as being a female, cis, heterosexual, all of these various identities. I'm relatively well educated. I grew up in a very middle class family. These things are inseparable in the way I interact with society around me and in determining my lived experiences. And so because of that, you can't really necessarily separate those different, I would call them properties even in a way, these different properties from each other in discussing my experiences with reality.
Right. That makes complete
So,
sense.
okay.
Yeah. I mean,
I feel like I'm rambling.
that's all. It's fine. That's why I want to have you on, because I want to hear you ramble. So.
Yay! I'm good at that.
I have noticed, and of course, sectionality I came across in relation to LGBT, but also POC, people of color. And I had a friend who kind of explained it to me before. Basically, like you were saying, people have different properties. They're not, one monolithic thing. I mean, like I'm a white, cis, straight guy. So
Right.
those are different properties. And I'm pretty far up on this, on the privilege ladder. I'm not rich, which is another property. Your socioeconomic status would be another one, I would say. So,
Yeah.
but I am pretty far up on the privilege scale. Now you are Asian, I guess you could say. Chinese, I'm sorry, I guess is a better way to put it. Female, I don't know about your socioeconomic status, I won't assume. So you would probably be considered lower down the scale, but I guess in privilege terms. But then again, you said your education and your upbringing were fairly, I guess, normal. I don't know, normal is the right word, but privileged, I guess, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's hard to measure privilege in a two-dimensional way, just because it's hard to measure anything human in kind of a two-dimensional way. So there are, basically, by virtue of having grown up in the U.S., in New Jersey, in the exact town that I grew up in, surrounded by the population I was surrounded in, all of those things have kind of formulated who I am today. And so those aspects definitely demonstrate a certain amount of privilege. Like I went to a public school that was relatively well funded because I live in a school district where people could afford to pay a lot in property taxes. So we had access to my freshman year, every student was given a laptop for all 4 years. For example, that was a new program that was started at my school, I think the year I started attending. But the variation in public school education in different districts across different states, just depending on where you live, varies so much based on your socioeconomic status. And so I was relatively well off in that way, for example. And like you said, however, I am visibly Asian. I'm visibly East Asian in particular. So people can kind of generally assume that I'm Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. And that will also affect the way people interact with me, because there are certain assumptions that come along with what a young Asian woman might do, or there are certain stereotypes that are surrounded with this identity. People will look at me and they'll immediately see my Asianness rather than the fact that I was born in the US, that I'm American, for example. And so that in itself, I don't know whether I would call it, I guess it's hard for me to discuss whether that's privilege or not, whether I would define some of these distinctions in how people interact with me as privilege or not, because there are certain ways that I know how to manipulate the expectations people have of me for my own benefit, just because I understand the societal stereotypes. But we are living still in a country where white supremacy or white nationalism is dominant. So no matter, I guess, what types of privileges or benefits there are from this visible identity, I don't know whether I could call that privilege or not. Again, I really think all of it is so contextual, and all of the language that we use for social justice stuff is so contextual. So it's not two-dimensional is what I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah, we kind of briefly talked about that online, about kind of the situational based idea. Because, like you said, it's complicated. You can't use one, there's not one aspect that, people are complicated. People are, multidimensional, generally speaking. There are some, I would say, who aren't terribly multidimensional, but most people are, and most people are shallow, to be honest with you. And they see somebody, the first time they see somebody, what they see is their appearance. And
right.
So they see you, and they might make certain assumptions, like you said, and might not know or care if you have have the deeper things like a education, and that you were raised in a neighborhood or a town that's fairly well off or whatever. They may not see that. So like you said, it's kind of complicated and there are different layers to it, but generally speaking, I think intersectionality is well defined as something that is just, we have to recognize that our different people have different properties, like you said, and we just kind of need to take that into account if we are going to be socially aware and social justice aware, which not everybody unfortunately is.
Right.
Now, I wanted to specifically talk about the Women's March and the kind of idea that you brought up, and I'm sure it's not the first time. I'm sure it happens frequently on other occasions when anything regarding feminism is discussed, but specifically the Women's March. And I saw you posting stuff because you were there in D.C. about the Women's March, and you seem to be rather, I don't know, irritated, upset, pissed off, dare I say, because
I was angry.
yeah, because you kind of, the idea this white woman was telling, I forgot the specific incident. There was too many people trying to get in at once, and then what is she? Do you know what I'm talking about? You remember what I'm talking about?
I do. I can definitely talk about all of this because I have so many thoughts about the Women's March. And in fact, I think that was a major turning point for me in a way, in terms of learning how to express my anger, for example, or realizing that I should be more angry about white feminism. Because while I knew all of these things in theory, it wasn't until a white woman actually messaged me and asked me to not cause so much division. Well, I think what she said was something along the lines of lay off or, ease up on the white feminism jabs, because why try and divide us? And she had compared me to a Breitbart article that said something along the lines of Hillary Clinton supporters are the only ones who are out there marching because they're angry about her losing or whatever. So, white women. So there's that part, but there were also other things that happened at the march itself. So I went to the march with two of my friends. One of them is this white Italian chick from Ohio. And the other one is one of my friends from high school who is clearly Asian. She's Chinese. She looks Chinese. Anyway, we went onto the metro. And if you know anything about the DC Metro and the Red Line, you'll know that you're not going to expect to see majority white people on the metro, at least not for those stops. And so we got on the metro, and the first thing we noticed was, wow, it is really white in here. And I mean, I noticed right away. My Chinese friend obviously noticed right away. And Frankie, the Italian chick, she also noticed right away, because we talk about this stuff all the time. We talk about white feminism all the time. But I would say that if you are a person who is not used to being surrounded by people of color, or even if you're not from the DC area, you wouldn't have noticed how white those metro trains were. So that's, I guess, the first time when we noticed that the march was extremely white, even though I kind of had heard that it was going to be more white people, because they didn't really include intersectionality into their march until later on. And then they started adding really great female activists of color as organizers. But I mean, if you're always invited late to a party, you kind of know who the priority is and who the march really is for. And so I think that's why a lot of women of color didn't show up. Anyway, getting back to the whole getting to the march situation. So we're all just making jokes this whole time. So the whole time I'm online and I'm just posting things that we noticed. Oh, there are so many Starbucks cups in the garbage cans. White feminism. Or whatever. We were just kind of making jokes about this whole situation. But then at the very march itself, there were a lot of speeches. There were a lot of, I think if you watch any of it, you'll notice that I think there were famous celebrities there, like Scarlett Johansson, for example. Madonna sang a song. There were lots of really great activists. Angela Davis was there. Janelle Monáe was there. Anyway, so there were a lot of speeches. We're standing at the National Mall watching one of the teleprompters of one of the speeches, and this one older woman next to me, she's getting a little bit exasperated. And this was at the time when Janelle Monáe, she had invited mothers of victims of police brutality onto the stage, and they were performing a song in honor of all of the victims. And so it was the hashtag say her name, hashtag say his name. They were talking about Sandra Bland. They were talking about Eric Garner. But by this point, so many people had spoken that the march was off schedule. So it was starting later than it should have started. And so this older woman next to me, she was clearly exasperated. And at one point during this speech, she goes, "Oh, can we kind of just get on with it already? Like, why are we still can we march?" And I yelled at her. I just snapped, and I was like, "Really though? Do you you've had enough? You don't think that Black people have had enough of being killed for no reason? Do you think that these mothers should be standing on their stage mourning that their children have died before them?" Like, I started going at it, and she's this little old lady, and I'm sure she was tired from standing there and everything, but all of a sudden I just snapped and I got really angry, and I think that was kind of the beginning of it. And I posted that on Facebook, and a couple of other things had happened during the march, and that had led to my high school English teacher basically sending that message, calling me a little bit Breitbardian or whatever. And that's what enraged me and got me started.
Yeah, I saw that letter you posted, that message you posted. But what I was really inspired by was the way she responded when you explained to her that you didn't, I guess, appreciate it, and that, kind of your arguments against what she said, and she basically acknowledged it and seemed to come around a bit.
That was amazing. That entire interaction is something that I've reflected on for a little bit, even after that, because when I first got her message, I was surprised. I felt a little bit offended, but I was also kind of just hurt. I was like, this is my high school English teacher who I still have a huge amount of respect for. And so I was shocked that out of the blue, she had messaged me about something like this. And I actually thought to myself, am I being too offensive? Are my jokes really actually divisive? And then I sent her screenshot to one of my friends, another social justice activist. And he's like, I don't know why you're not angrier about this. Like, I am furious on your behalf. I want to respond to her on your behalf. And that's when I kind of was coming to terms with being angry and realizing that I didn't want my level of anger to be dictated either by white people or by people of color telling me I should be angrier. I just wanted to be the perfect amount of angry, because I think that a lot of well-meaning white people say things like that, say things like "don't be divisive." And I've met a good amount who do want to change the world. However, it's so extremely insensitive and hurtful when they say things like that, because it shows how oblivious they are to the fact that people of color, or that people have had issues in politics to care about way before Trump's election, way before this women's march. And so for people who were boycotting the march or who couldn't go out to the march because they were too angry to go out to the march, the reason was because it is a privilege to be able to not pay attention to politics until now. The water protectors have been out in North Dakota for what has it been, like almost more than a year now. I don't remember. Yeah, and I mean, people have been marching for Black Lives Matter for also since 2015. And all of a sudden now all of these people are coming out and saying, "Oh, this is my first time. It's so exciting." It just to those activists who have been out there, it's so hurtful. It's heartbreaking. It's like we were not important enough, or we were so invisible that it isn't until this moment that you actually care enough to come out. And then on top of that, though, you're calling us divisive, and you're telling us that we should just all come together and be nice to each other. But it's like, it's such a privilege to be able to do that. Anyway, I'm kind of diverting again. So this is why there is so much anger this is why it's difficult to say, oh, let's just all sing kumbaya and like we should welcome them into the movement with open arms or whatever. However, that kind of anger, of course, makes it really difficult to build movement. Just kind of realistically speaking. And it's not that we have to be nice to let people in the movement, because like why wouldn't you join a movement for social progress? Why wouldn't you join something that helps to elevate people who have been oppressed just because they're not nice to you? Like, if that is your rationale for not participating, then you probably didn't care about humanity in the first place. Like, I don't need to send you an invitation. You should just care if you cared so much in the first place. But on the other hand, if we don't kind of, if there's no way for them to kind of enter or kind of to overcome those barriers to entry, then they're never going to be part of the movement. So an example of this is, I guess, in my personal approach to activism on my Facebook. When I was angry about white feminism, I shared a lot of posts by other women of color and a lot of articles explaining the rationale behind the anger, but also asking white people to actually take these posts seriously and to actually read them and to try and understand where all of the anger is coming from and to unpack all of that, instead of saying, you know what, just stay in your lane. Instead of telling them you're doing something wrong, but I'm not going to explain to you what, because it's not my place to do it. And yeah, I don't have to put out all that emotional energy to teach or to educate them. If you want oppression to end, then you should be willing to put in the work. But I also do think that I would like to help them. I do have the energy to kind of at least put the resources out there. And if they want to read them and actually care enough to do that, then good. But what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that there is a middle line and there is a fine balance. And that is the line, or that is my personal approach to activism that I want to continue to bring forth, because I want them to recognize why my anger is valid, but I don't want them to react to my anger in such a way where they're actually not going to be useful.
They're going to shut down, basically, emotionally, is what you're saying. They're going to, like...
Right. Yeah.
See, and this, I understand what you're saying, and I've seen some of these, actually shared one of these posts, but basically saying, you know, if somebody tells you that you, what was it? I hate white people. Some black person says, I will hate white people, and, you know, says all this shit. I mean, if that's pissing you off enough to, like, well, I'm not going to help you out then you didn't give a fuck to begin with, you know?
Right.
I mean, it's about wanting people to be equal, you know, to have equal opportunities and shit, and you're letting one person put you off that much that you don't want equality for people, and go fuck yourself. I mean, that's just me, okay? And then you were talking about that, wanting to walk that fine line between not pissing people off, but also making them understand why people of color are upset and why their anger is valid, not to tone police them, you know, and let them speak about what's wrong with the movement and why they're angry. I think white allies have a role to play in bridging that gap between, like, almost kind of being a translator, I guess, sometimes maybe. Now, of course, and like I said, people of color you should shut up and let them speak most of the time. But if there is some white people that you're just not, they don't know any people of color maybe, and maybe explain to them why they're upset to their fellow white people, then maybe they'll listen. They're more likely to listen to you as a white person, perhaps, and maybe they'll understand better. That's just a theory of mine. And not everybody has to be like you and, you know, be calm and rational. And some people are like, you have to be calm and rational all the time or nobody will take you seriously. Why don't you stop being so loud, you know? And, that's something else that drives me, you know, up the wall. So there's different roles for different kinds of people in the movement. And not everybody's going to be, you know, the angry, whatever they call it, you know, angry activist type, and some people are rational, and some people aren't. I mean, it's just there's a whole different people. But don't tone police people just because you don't agree with the way if they're too angry or something.
Right, exactly. And I also think that 100% it is the job of white allies to educate other white people. It's definitely the number one responsibility of what white allies to do that. In fact, the reason why I am so concerned about this anger is because anger can be very useful. Anger has its function in social movements like this. And I find that learning how to express my own anger has been really helpful in the past couple of months, for example, and learning how to harness that energy. However, it can also create really toxic environments and cause burnout really quickly. And this is not just when we are trying to build a bridge between white people and people of color, or just the discussion of allyship and how terrible people who have privilege, who don't necessarily need to care about these issues, it's not even about that. It's just even within communities of color, the anger and the decision to not provide emotional labor for each other because we feel that we have the right to preserve that energy, which is absolutely true. I think that right now is at a place where it's something that we need to become more self-aware of, and we need to figure out how to create kind of communities that feel safer. For example, what I'm talking about is recently a couple of my friends and I have been discussing how even within feminist coalitions, there are conversations that happen in them where people of color will disagree with each other about what is cultural appropriation, about what is the proper use of language. And you don't want to tone police each other, but on the other hand, the anger kind of overcomes any sort of ability to have a conversation with each other. And so these environments, or these coalitions where you're supposed to be able to prioritize these marginalized voices, actually become really, really frightening places to interact with each other. Just like commenting on a post might start a war, for example. And I know that personally, I don't have the kind of psychological armor to handle that sort of thing. So there's I think that there needs to be, possibly for everybody, more of an effort to be self-aware, and more of an effort to I guess, to develop the amount of emotional energy we have, the amount of emotional labor we have. Does that make sense?
Develop the amount of emotional labor you have. Is that what you said?
Yeah, like the amount that we can actually give. So I know that people will talk about having spoons. Like, I have the spoons, or I have the emotional labor, like the emotional energy to provide emotional labor, for example.
Okay.
And so we are in this world right now where we're kind of exploring consent and exploring autonomy and exploring how giving we have to be to other people, and how to develop our own boundaries. And this is because we are all trying to validate and confirm our own existence. By we, I mean kind of even marginalized populations now are developing this social justice language in which to describe their existence. And so by doing that, we are making people who have been invisible be able to be visible in a society where certain narratives have been confirmed as being the dominant one, or as being the true one. And now we're saying, no, those aren't necessarily the dominant narratives. Like, here is my own, and this is just as true, and this is just as valid. But in order to be able to say that to somebody else and mean it, you have to believe it, right? You have to have the confidence to say that this is my lived experience. And for someone who has been challenged all their lives with another more dominant narrative. So, for example, the myth of American meritocracy, we can use that one. So the idea that everything done so far, or all of my achievements and success is because of my own hard work and my ability to, I guess, to go through to meet these certain societal markers of achievement, these milestones, and that's just due to hard work and not because of any specific understanding of how the system works and being socialized in a way to interact with authority that is pleasing and will allow me to continue to move up. And so that myth of meritocracy have been the dominant narrative that is kind of pushing against our own. And then when you start to realize, or one starts to become aware of the way that things actually work, that no, this is not, meritocracy doesn't actually exist in this way in the United States. In fact, there is a lot of discrimination just built into our institutions. That is really hard to say confidently when everybody else is telling you, no, what you're saying is not true. So we learn to validate these lived experiences, right? So we learn how to express ourselves and be completely confident in what we're saying. But in order to do so, we also have to tell other people to not tone police us. We have to tell other people to not gaslight us. And in doing so, the more that you try and solidify one narrative, the easier it becomes to say that this is the one and only truth, and that your truth is not as valid as my truth, instead of saying that the world is very complex and full of a lot of contradictions, and all of these truths may be true at the same time.
That makes sense to me.
Okay.
There isn't one absolute truth, and there is not one narrative that governs every situation. They intersect. I mean, that's kind of the idea. I mean, there's different complex intersectionality for different. I mean, you can be a person of color, but you still have different needs and wants. If you're black, or if you're Hispanic, or if you're Asian, it just depends. There are different levels of needs, and there's different unique needs for each group, and even each person maybe. It just all depends upon your individual lived experience, like you said. And we just have to make sure that we recognize that people have their own lived experiences, and there's not one overarching narrative
Right.
that everybody has, and just kind of keep that in mind.
Right. When we were talking about the emotional energy and the way that a lot of these communities, I find, aren't reflective enough on themselves, what I really meant was that when we're telling our truths, we need to make sure that we're not necessarily doing that with blinders on, and not doing that just, and deprioritizing all other truths. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's just general, to me, that's empathy. That's general empathy, trying to understand other people's experiences and trying not to demean them in any way just because it's not something you are familiar with or something that you may have experienced.
Right.
I mean, that's the way I look at it anyway. I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean, it's definitely, especially being a white person, it is especially important to listen and not say much of anything except to clarify the lived experiences of people of color, women, the LGBT community. And I think it's difficult for some people in general. I think humans, it's difficult to be told that you are wrong or that you're doing something incorrectly, perhaps, and maybe you could do it better this way. Most people seem to automatically get defensive anytime you do that. And I think that's counterproductive. I mean, and that just to me shows human nature is it's just something you have to work on. It's not something that just comes automatically. Some people are that way automatically, and good for them. But I think that may be a minority. It's definitely something I had to work through, because when I started getting into this idea of, intersectionality and the fact that people of color and women and our LGBT are being oppressed in certain ways, and I'm like, and they're like, maybe you should just take a look at your privilege and see, what it is that you can do to help. And I automatically, first I got defensive about what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm trying my best, but then I realized, look, you just have to listen, not take things so personally. It's not a personal issue. it's an issue of entire groups being disenfranchised. And so you just kind of need to get past yourself, and kind of put yourself in other people's shoes. So I rambled a little bit there, but
No, not at all. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's very uncomfortable to hear all these other truths, especially if you're insecure about your own. Because, for example, when I was at the Women's March, someone on stage had said something about Black mothers raising their sons. And then this one white woman, she's just in the crowd, I overheard her saying this, and she said, "What about white mothers raising their sons?" It's like, just because we're talking about one particular experience or one particular group of people doesn't mean that your situation doesn't also exist. It doesn't mean, and I think that it's hard for humans, or it's hard for us to not see or to not try to take things personally, as you had said.
yeah, I mean, it's like Black Lives Matter. A lot of people assume it's only Black Lives Matter is implied. No, it's also Black Lives Matter, because
Right.
they are not recognized most of the time. I mean, they want Black people to protest in the right way, which basically means sitting there and just, I don't feel like this is good, or something, be all, timid and almost, it just, when they do protest non-violently, they're like, no, not that way, just
Right.
like when Kaepernick decided he was going to kneel for the national anthem, people are like, oh, that's horrible, Well, what,
Offended.
I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, when Black people line the street trying to block traffic, you say that's too much, so there's no right way, basically, I guess, for people of color to protest, just.
No, not if it's not protest for a message that you don't agree with. In which case, there's never a right way to protest.
Well, exactly. I mean, you didn't hear them complaining when the Tea Party folk were doing all kinds of bizarre shit back when Obama was elected. I mean, did you see some of that just blatantly racist shit that they were, hanging, hanging them in effigy and shit, calling them, all kinds of fucking racist slurs and, but you don't hear them complaining about that shit, or them toting guns around in every fucking Walmart across the country, I mean, it just, white privilege just soaked in it, just absolutely drenched in that privilege, and they don't even realize it.
Right. To ask somebody to be nice is basically saying to work within the system. But if asking nicely had worked, maybe, the first time, decades, centuries ago, then we wouldn't still be asking. Well, we wouldn't still be angry. We wouldn't be trying to come up with all these new creative ways to protest in a way that actually disrupts the system.
Yeah, and it's just like the whole idea, like MLK, they want to whitewash him today and act like he was some peaceful activist or whatever. No, he was the most hated man in America, and that was, or dangerous man in America, I believe. FBI head, what's his name? Wow,
I know what you're talking about.
For some reason, it's blowing past my head. I can see his face. Anyway, yeah, he was despised even by people in the black community, some people in the black community, because he was going too far. They thought he was being too radical,
Right.
he was anti-war, and he was for workers' rights, and so he wasn't two-dimensional, and people seem to forget that. And when conservatives today invoke him, I just want, I get so pissed off about that. You just need to shut the fuck up and get his name out your mouth. You don't need to say a damn word about MLK, because you know nothing of anything he represented. If you're trying to invoke him as some kind of example. Ugh. Anyway.
Yeah. Extremely frustrating.
Why did you think that it's so difficult to either get people of color involved in some of these movements, such as the March for Washington, which was overwhelmingly white? Was it because they weren't invited, they didn't feel comfortable, or was it because they just didn't think, I don't know, that they'd be effective? I mean, what do you think?
I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but I think that for me, the reason why I didn't really want to go to the march in the first place, because a couple of days before I went to this training at American University it was a series of workshops basically on nonviolent direct action, for example. And this one activist was talking about how she uses her intuition. She pays attention to her intuition when she decides whether she wants to go to a protest or not, and that her intuition told her to stay away from this particular women's march. And that's because she felt like even the slightest potential of violence there, like, might occur there, and that she was not comfortable with going, and that she just wanted to listen to her gut this time, because even though sometimes rationally she's been to marches where it made sense, her gut had told her not to go, and and things, and clearly negative things had happened. And I mean, that sounds like a very faithy thing to say, but it kind of got me thinking about the reasons why I wanted to go to this march. And my reasoning was, well, it's probably kind of a once in a lifetime occurrence. And I live so close to DC that I feel like it's my responsibility to go, just because I happen to be able to. Like, that's privilege, right? And I'm not, I am able-bodied, and so I wouldn't have too much of an issue going to the march. But I was like, there's going to be so many people. I hate people. I hate being around people.
Yeah.
Things are going to be crowded. It's going to suck. So I was like, I don't want to go. And then I was like, but I like dressing up and getting all pretty, and I want a pink wig. And so I ended up going because I was like, let's do some arts and crafts and make sweatshirts with slogans on it and stuff. And that's why I ended up going. But because of going to that previous training, I kind of was like, I should listen to my gut a little bit too. Like, I knew I was set on this march, but did I actually think about why? Anyway, I think that it's this march, the reason why I might not have, for ideological reasons, the reason that would have kind of swayed me to not go is the fact that so many of these people are showing up for the first time, and it's kind of like, well, where were you this entire time when we were fighting for things that are important to our survival? Oh yeah, that's right. You weren't around because those things weren't vital to your survival. In fact, you might not have noticed how much those issues have impacted our lives, and that's your privilege. And this is something that I can actually definitely relate to, because for the majority of my life, I didn't notice my Asianness as being something that is a part of my identity that I have to reckon with. From my entire childhood, basically, I didn't realize that I was Asian until middle school. Like, I didn't know that that was a concept that was applied to me by other people, basically. I knew I was Chinese, and I knew that I was American, but I didn't know how white my education was. I think I wrote a Facebook post a couple of days ago when I realized that I had internalized white guilt as a child for slavery, because that's how American I felt. I don't have any ancestors who were slaveholders. In fact, as a more recent immigrant, well, like, my parents were more recent immigrants, and I was born in the U.S. My Americanness actually feels less valid than the Americanness of both American Black folks and white folks, but that's a totally different story. Anyway, so this Asianness, I didn't think it affected me because I excelled at school. I was a very nice person. Generally, I respected authority. I was very good at conforming. I knew how to talk to my teachers in ways that would help me get good grades. My parents had enough money to pay for me to apply for Ivy League schools. I applied to like maybe a dozen different schools, for example, and I had a legitimate chance of going to these institutions, for example, and I had a legitimate chance of kind of, I guess, securing a comfortable financial future, and then not having to think about issues that affect just kind of mere survival, because those things were just kind of invisible to me, right? And so my Asianness, I didn't really think that it had an effect on me. However, I think it was only after I returned from university, coming back to the States, that I realized that my Chineseness was actually, or that people viewed my Asianness in ways that affect how they interact with me. And so I still happen to live in a racist society where white supremacy rules. It is white supremacist. And so I am affected by all of those things, even if as a child or when I was growing up, those things seemed invisible to me, right? So I didn't have to face, for example, the fear of deportation. I didn't have to face the fear of not having food to eat. I didn't have to face kind of going to a bad school, like I said, for example. And so because I didn't have any of these things, it's easy for me to not notice that they occur to other people, right? And so I could have just not gone, not cared about social justice at all. I could be working towards an MBA right now and getting a corporate job. I could still be doing that. I know how to talk nice people, to white people. I know how to play the game, but that'll never make me white enough, and that'll never help other groups of people of color to gain equality. And so no matter what level of financial success I achieve in this country, at the end of the day, it's still going to be unequal. But I wouldn't have to care about it, right? Because I would probably be mingling well enough to support my kids or my family or whatever. And my immediate family would be very proud and happy for me. And so I would never have to care about any of these other issues that are affecting people. And I think that's why so many white people didn't show up until now, that things like reproductive rights, or Planned Parenthood and abortion are kind of getting threatened, and that sexism is more blatant of an issue, because Trump is blatantly sexist. Because of that, that's when white women actually show up. But before that, when all these issues affect women of color that might not necessarily touch the lives of white women directly, that's why they weren't there before. So now this march just felt like a march that prioritized those issues that were particularly salient to, or that I guess white women had on their radar, where there are clearly lots of other issues affecting women of color that they don't have on their radar.
So what do you think people can do, white people can do, or white women can do to try to become more inclusive of people of color and other minority groups?
So first they have to actually want it. So, I mean, there are a lot of white feminists who have just basically been saying, how dare you be so divisive? Why are you writing all of these articles about how much you hate white feminists? Like, why it becomes centered on their whiteness and their white feminism is rather than on these other issues. So if they want to be more inclusive, then you need women of color clearly in decision-making positions, leadership roles in organizations. You need to actually do what you were saying earlier, to actively listen to women of color and to prioritize their issues, and to not ask women of color to have to express things in a particular way in order for their message to be more palatable. I think just by prioritizing or by elevating the voices of women of color, they'll be able to be a lot more inclusive. But the initial desire for true inclusivity must be there. Otherwise, it would never happen.
So they need to want it. They need to want to be inclusive in the first place.
Right. And there's a lot of of course we want to include you, but kind of as a kind of in a sideline kind of fashion.
It's patronizing, really.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of like the idea of wanting to include somebody versus the actual actions of including somebody.
Yeah, I just think a lot of that is just this internalized white privilege. They're so used to being the center of everything that they can't even imagine anybody else, kind of instead of being a co-headliner or whatever, they're used to being the top headliner. Everybody else is just kind of, well, you know what, you can participate, but you're going to be kind of, second fiddle or whatever.
Right. I keep feeling like I need to prove that I'm just as American as a white woman. And I don't know. I mean, I know why I feel this way, but I shouldn't have to feel that way. Like, what does that even mean, to be just as American or not? And the reason why I do feel that way is because the narratives of being American are centered around white people and are centered around white women. So they never have to see outside what society tells them is already true. And so I need to always fight to make sure that they hear that even though I am Chinese, I am American. Like, I'm not a Chinese national, for example. I just happen to have Chinese heritage. And I can include that as part of my culture and also have that as my ethnicity, but also be American by nationality and culture as well.
Well, and we need to realize that I wanted to bring this up. This is the 75th anniversary of the Japanese internment camps. So it can, if you're not white, you might, you might be interned somewhere just because you don't look white. And I know people are like, well, that's never going to happen again. Really? Because Trump is wanting to round up Muslims just because they're Muslims. I mean, of course there was that thing going around the National Guard troops are going to do something, but don't think that's true. But I mean, it's not far from reality to think that could happen. So I think white people need to understand that there are people who are genuinely frightened for their very existence. And I don't think they really understand that. Or at least they don't understand it as a main topic. It's not like the biggest thought in their head. It's like kind of a side thing because it's not directly affecting them.
Right. And it's hard to convey that to them because they're not threatened directly by it, as you were saying. And I am viewed as a perpetual foreigner, even though I'm from here, for example. So I am seen basically based on being Chinese, even though I've only been to China twice in my life.
I know, and I have to admit, back in the day, well, this is over 20 years ago, I was in class with an Asian girl, and I was like, and her last name was Chinese, and her middle name was very Chinese. I was like, where are you from? I'm like, oh my God, really? Did I just fucking ask somebody that? She was like, I'm from here. I was like, why are you getting so upset? And then, of course, now I'm like, you're a fuckwit. Of course she was getting upset. So I understand where you're coming from with that. And people need to, I think it's a learning experience for a lot of people because they genuinely don't even think about it unless you bring it up. And I know people like you who try to explain these things. It's exhausting. I mean, you just get tired of saying the same fucking thing 100 times. It gets old. Having to constantly, tell people, yes, I'm American. I shouldn't have to fucking reiterate this again, but I am American. Okay. So, and I think, I'm sorry for that. I know, I think that's shitty, but unfortunately that's the way things are.
Yeah, that's kind of just how I see it too. I mean, and it's human nature partially too, right? Like, I mean, I get how that works. I get how that happens. It's just, there are, I think, better ways of going about it than others. Like, try not to make assumptions as much as possible, for example, just because somebody isn't white. Like the default in America is still that American equals white. It has never really been a nation of immigrants. It's always been kind of like, we're going to try really hard to not let you in until we really have to let you in.
Yes, definitely. And it's not just people of color. The Irish were considered black for a long time. And of course,
exactly.
So, I mean, it's not the whole narrative of this being an immigrant nation is just fucking bullshit, in the end. It's nativist.
Yes. That continues to show how whiteness is just a social construct and how it's continued to evolve over time. All of these things, ethnicity and culture and nationality, can be so easily conflated and they I think that when they're conflated and they're politically charged, as it turns out to be in the US, that's where all of the issues arise. And that's why it's so difficult to have a discussion about lived experiences and about truth.
Yeah, exactly.
These identities just happen to have so much meaning, apparently.
Well, I'm going to wrap things up. I have kept you long enough, I think. Why don't you tell everybody kind of where they can get in touch with you, if you want them to get in touch with you, or where your stuff is, or because I know you're a writer and such, so, and an activist, so.
Cool. Well, thank you, Chris, for having me. I know that I ranted a lot. There was a lot of nervous energy going on. But yeah, I write for Everyday Feminism mostly right now. I can also be found on medium.com. I occasionally blog there. I guess the best place to reach me is probably my Facebook, which is just my full name. But those are the main places you can reach me right now. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about intersectional feminism and empathic action and radical vulnerability and all that. And hopefully in a much more articulate way because there's a reason why I'm a writer and not a speaker.
Whatever, you were fine.
Oh gosh.
Like you said, it was nervous energy, but I mean, you articulated it quite well. You know, it's not like you were just, to me anyway, some people might disagree, but I enjoy this kind of conversation. I like to hear people have this kind of stream of consciousness, but that's just me.
Thank you. Well, you definitely facilitated that. I also do want to add, like, it's very poignant to me that we happen to have this conversation today because it's both Toni Morrison's birthday and Audre Lorde's birthday. Well, she passed away in 1990 something, but today is the anniversary of her birthday as well. And she is such a kindred spirit. Just read everything that she writes because she will cover intersectional feminism in a way that I could never express so quintessentially.
I'll definitely have to put that up, and we'll check those out on your recommendation. All right, Jessica. Well, again, thanks for coming on and talk to me, and it's been great.
My pleasure.
All right, Jessica. Well, take it easy.
All right, you too.
That'll do it for this episode of the Podunk Polymath Podcast. I want to thank Jessica Xiao for coming on and talking to me about intersectional feminism and all the different things associated with it. Very informative conversation, and I'm glad I got to talk to her. Of course, if you want to come check out the show, thepodunkpolymath.com. You can check me out on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google Plus under the Podunk Polymath. Music is done by ... Their website, cdbaby.com/cd/... Of course, you can email the show at podunk.polymath@gmail.com. There's a call-in number, 615-378-POPO-7676. And of course, as everybody already knows, the 7676 is for the dual freedom you get by listening. Of course, you can come join the Podunk Polymath Podcast Posse group on Facebook /groups/the Podunk Polymath Podcast Posse, separated by periods. All that is those words. Of course, if you look on the sidebar of the page, you'll see where you can follow me on WordPress. My tweets are there. You can donate via PayPal, subscribe on RSS, Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher. And of course, there's a Patreon button if you want to become part of the posse for as little as $1 a month. Recent posts and recent comments. Check out my show, any of those places. Tell all your friends. Leave a review on iTunes so it gets more visibility. I've been getting a little more lately, so I'm happy about that, but I can always use more. And I remind you again that NanoCon is coming up in less than 2 weeks. At $20 out the door are tickets unless they're sold out before then. $15 up to the date. Hurry up and get your tickets, you might miss out. All right, y'all. Well, hope y'all have a joyous week, and y'all take it easy now, okay?